Well. Welcome back for session two. And I hope that the break has refreshed all of us. And for this session, we have a person who is widely published analytic philosopher and an author. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995, and she has published extensively in the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology and in its application to the evaluation of testimony and to the philosophy of religion. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in her books. One, Hidden in Plain View, where she talks about undesigned coincidence in the Gospels and Acts. Two, The Mirror or the Mask, where she talks about liberating the Gospels from literary devices. And most recently, the third one, The Eye of the Beholder, where she talks about the Gospel of John as historical reportage. I'm getting excited just by sharing about her, and it's none other than Lydia McGrew. Do note down your questions and save them for the Q&A sessions, which we'll be having at the end. And right now, let me just hand over the stage to Lydia. Let's welcome her with a round of virtual applause. Over to you.
Thank you, Ankit, and thank you to Areopagus for this opportunity to speak to you. I have been asked to say just a few words about why I'm leaning back like this. I I have a chronic pain condition that makes this the most comfortable position for me to deliver, and that will enable me to focus more clearly on what I have to say to you today. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the camera, and I'm going to begin to share screen so that you can see my PowerPoint slides, and I will come back uh, with the camera during the question and answer roundtable that follows this session. So here we go. I'm talking today about how you can know that Jesus rose from the dead. So Jesus died. Then what? And we might say, so what? It's not at all unusual for people to die. Most of us do. But what's remarkable is what happened next after Jesus died. Because his followers began to claim that he had literally, physically risen again from the dead. And they began to claim this within about 6 weeks publicly of his crucifixion. Well, that is at least somewhat unusual, and that's what we need to try to explain. I suggest that there are three options for explaining the fact that Jesus' followers testified that he was risen from the dead and testified the details that they did and in the way that they did and in the context that they did. First option is that maybe they were liars. The second option is that maybe they were mistaken in thinking that he was literally risen from the dead. And the third option is that he really rose from the dead. I think those are the three possibilities. Okay, well, let's consider the first of them. Were they lying? Now, I want to say right now that when we're evaluating a claim like this, there is nothing wrong with considering the possibility of fraud. Christians should not shy away from that, like, oh, I'm offended. For centuries, the older apologists have not ducked that question and they've considered it straight up. And they've been willing to say that in other cases of other alleged religious miracles, there was fraud. So, was this a kind of pious fraud perpetrated by at least some of his followers? I'm going to argue that the context of the claims that they made makes it very improbable that they were lying. Well, what do I mean by the context? What's highly unusual about this is that they were made first, publicly, second, to a hostile audience, and third, in an attempt to found a new religious group. Now, that's not quite as common as just saying that one has had a paranormal experience or that one saw someone who had died. To claim publicly to a hostile audience and an attempt to found a new religious group that a person is physically risen from the dead is unusual. You know, it's much easier to get away with religious fraud when the miracle claims are being circulated only within a group that is already disposed to believe them. You'd be surprised how often that's what happens. There's a big difference between making such claims in the context of an existing religion that is already under persecution and making them to an audience that is going to persecute you for those very claims. That's a really important distinction. I have a couple of videos on my YouTube channel about the so called rainbow body claims that are made in Tibet. And I emphasize there that even though the Tibetan Buddhists were, in general, a persecuted group, the claims of rainbow body were not usually made to a hostile audience who were going to persecute them for that very claim. But that's what we find the disciples doing. They're out there, they're talking to even the religious leaders who just a short time before had brought about the death of Jesus by crucifixion. And they're saying to them, we must testify to what we have heard and seen. It's much easier to get away with religious fraud or lying about the paranormal when there's no penalty for your claims, beyond at most the purely social penalty of being laughed at or disbelieved. I want to emphasize that again because, you know, there are lots of paranormal claims out there. People claim to have seen Elvis risen from the dead. They claim to have seen ghosts. They claim to have done a lot of things. And those are much more plausibly made up because the most that's going to happen is that they're going to be laughed at. But the religious leaders had just gotten Jesus crucified. Jesus' followers who made these claims knew that they were risking their lives by doing so. Some of them indeed paid with their lives. I'm emphasizing, though, at first, they're knowing that they were risking their lives. It's not like they got out there and they tried this thinking that they were going to continue a religious movement and then they got persecuted and they said, oh, this was more dangerous than we realized. No, they knew it was extremely dangerous to begin with. Something I'll be emphasizing under the mistaken heading, but I'll mention it here too, is that we are talking about followers who were in a position to know whether what they were claiming was true or false. People are often ready to die for an ideology. You'll hear people saying, what about suicide bombers for Islam? What about kamikaze pilots for Japan in World War II? But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about being willing to risk death and a terrible death for something where you personally would know if it was true or false, an empirical claim, a claim that they had seen Jesus alive from the dead. And so it's not just that they got all caught up in an ideology or a political claim or a cult-like claim. Notice too that if it was false, they could simply have not made the claim. They could have just continued following their existing religious practices. All of Jesus' initial followers who testified to this were Jews. Occasionally, skeptics will say their lives would have been without meaning if they hadn't continued clinging, however crazily, to the idea that Jesus rose. That's not true. As Jews, their lives had meaning. They had a form of relationship with God through the sacrifices in the temple. They could have said, we were mistaken. They could have gone back to waiting for a different Messiah. That's what happened not long afterward with Simon Bar Kokhba. The Bar Kokhba rebellion occurred around 100 and a little after. And those people didn't claim he was raised from the dead. His movement just ended after he died. And that's what Jesus' followers could have done. They could have just kept their mouths shut, but they didn't. Well, let's go to were they mistaken? Now, this is a very popular interpretation of what happened. There are lots and lots of people, including many scholars, who don't want to say, oh, they just lied. In fact, the idea that they just lied isn't a terribly popular view right now. But they'll suggest that they had religious hysteria, or that in claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, they overinterpreted their experience or interpreted it in categories that they found comforting or good, but that were not really reasonable. But just like the context of the claims helps us to rule out the idea that they were lying, the content of the claims makes it extremely improbable that they were mistaken. Now, to evaluate this mistaken option, we really need to get into the details of what Jesus' original followers claimed that they would have known the truth or falsity of. If we just say vaguely that they had some kind of experiences that led them to believe that Jesus was risen, that isn't going to give us a very good way to evaluate the mistaken option, because maybe they were somewhat irrational. In fact, most skeptics and many mainstream New Testament scholars would say that they were unreasonable. Maybe they just had vague religious experiences or brief visions and misinterpreted those as meaning that Jesus really was resurrected. In his book on Jesus' resurrection, the scholar Dale Allison, who is very hesitant to affirm the physical resurrection of Jesus. At most, he's agnostic about that. He talks a lot about the sense of presence, SOP, he says, that many people have after their loved ones died. Well, if it was just a sense of presence or even a brief vision, then maybe we could say something paranormal happened, but not have evidence for a real physical resurrection. What did they claim? Well, they said that different groups of them had lengthy conversations with Jesus. This is very unusual. This is not something we find even in the grief hallucination literature of people having lengthy conversations in groups. They said that they met Jesus in the flesh on many different occasions. Again, both individuals and groups meeting him in the flesh. This produces variety in their testimony. They said that on different occasions, people were able to touch Jesus. Now, sometimes those people were alone, but sometimes it was groups of them able to touch Jesus, as when the women claimed that several of them were together, saw Jesus, and grasped his feet. And they even said that Jesus invited them to touch him. That's interesting and that's different. What else? Well, they said that Jesus ate with them on more than one occasion. Eating ghosts are not common at all, even in the ghost literature, especially not eating ghosts that eat with people while in groups. They said that Jesus convinced a previously skeptical disciple, namely Thomas, that he was risen from the dead. We have that story where Thomas is not with them, and then Thomas is with them, and he's in between. He's been scoffing, and then Jesus invites him to touch him on the second occasion. Notice that these different groupings and different appearance claims creates variety in the evidence and also a degree of independence concerning the influences and the motives for the different alleged witnesses. For example, James, the brother of Jesus, was very widely respected among the Jewish people. We actually find that affirmed in a later author named Hegesippus. And we find a implication of that in Josephus. So James, the brother of Jesus, had every motive to just stay quiet. And yet we find him a leader among the disciples in the early church. He would have had different influences than those who had been disciples of Jesus all along through his ministry, which James wasn't. Um, Joanna, for example, was the wife of Herod's steward, his household manager. Do you think the wife of Herod's steward or the husband of Joanna wanted his wife to be going around saying things that would make him look ridiculous? The women would have had different male relatives who would have influenced them differently. They said that Jesus was with them on earth for about 6 weeks after he rose from the dead. And then they said that after that, he went back to heaven. And then they distinguished the later visions that people had from the meetings that they claimed to have while he was on earth. So the vision of Stephen, for example, when he's being stoned, looks different from the meetings that are narrated in the Gospels where they're eating with him, he's talking to them for a long time, and so forth. So they weren't confusing visions with appearances here on earth. Now, these are not the kinds of things that you could just be mistaken about. My husband, Tim McGrew, likes to say to college students, suppose that a group of you were all together during spring break and you were with someone that you knew very well. And later someone told you that he had died prior to that time. You would say, no, 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 we were meeting with him over and over again. We all went together on a trip over spring break and we all saw him again and again and had big long conversations with him. That's not the kind of thing that's just a religious enthusiasm or a sense of presence or seeing him at a distance or a brief vision. So, if this is really what they experienced, it was actually rational. It was actually reasonable for them to think that Jesus was physically risen and literally physically with them. Notice too that in these lengthy group appearances experiences that they claimed, they would have been interacting with Jesus and with one another. So, for example, when they claimed that they had breakfast, about 7 of them had breakfast with him by the Sea of Galilee, they would have been handing Jesus the fish and getting the fish from him. Hey, Jesus, could you pass the fish over here? My husband and I like to call these polymodal experiences. That is to say, experiences involving touch, sight, hearing, even smell, all together, all these different senses together with different groups of people. That's not what hallucinations are like, where they go on and on like this, and a whole group of 7 or 12 or more people are all interacting with each other, looking at each other, looking at this person that they're all hallucinating at the same time. Now, what this leaves us with is the final option of those 3. I said lying, mistaken, or it was true. Jesus really was risen from the dead. Well, now, how can you avoid that conclusion? I'm not under any illusions that someone who is previously skeptical is just going to listen to a 15-minute declaration like that and not push back at all. I would say that your best bet, if you're trying to avoid believing that Jesus rose, is to hang on to the mistaken option. And I think your best bet is to say that they didn't really experience those things, and they didn't even claim to experience them. I think your best bet is to say that all of that stuff, or most of it that I just talked about, wasn't part of their original claim. It was added later. It wasn't what the people in a position to know claimed. The disciples, let's say, believed that Jesus was physically resurrected, but at most they had much vaguer, less detailed experiences, and they were just irrational. Go back to they were jumping to conclusions because their experiences weren't really like what I've just described. Bart Ehrman, the skeptical New Testament scholar, likes to talk about a telephone game. In a telephone game, one person repeats something to another person who repeats it to another person, and it gets corrupted over time. Now, this is where the importance of the gospel accounts come in. Are those physical aspects, those polymodal aspects, those variations among the accounts later embellishments? Are the resurrection stories partly made up? Well, that calls for us to ask, what are the Gospels? What were their authors like? What was the relationship of truth to the Gospel authors? Did they feel free to invent parts that would be useful to their message? Or were they accepting things at many distances, many removes, as we say in English, from what really happened? I would argue, and I have argued at length, that the gospel authors were careful and honest and knowledgeable. They were close to the facts. Are the gospels embellished? I'm claiming that they're not, that the gospel resurrection stories represent what the original people claimed. Now, that's not question begging, even if it's controversial, because it's not a miracle for the disciples to claim these things. So I'm not arguing in a circle. It provides, as I've argued, a very strong argument for a miracle if they did claim them. But as we've just seen, we could try to explain those claims as lies or as mistakes. But I'm not telling you that you have to accept the Gospels on faith, on blind faith. I'm saying that we can tell what these authors were like and what their accounts were like from other clues in their documents. Now, that's an interesting claim, and there's an awful lot of evidence relevant to it. What I'm going to give you here is what I would just call an evidence sampler. What kinds of evidence do we have for the honest and unembellished nature of the Gospels? Well, one kind of evidence we have is what's called external evidence. External evidence is evidence that connects the Gospels to statements and facts that we know of in other ways from outside the canon of Scripture. So, an example would be tiny details of geography. For example, John John's gospel tells us that Bethany was about 15 furlongs from Jerusalem. And when we translate furlongs and then we find the place that is now known as Bethany, the town of Lazarus, it's called, it is just about that distance from Jerusalem. Now, that's an indirect, but for that point, all the better for being indirect confirmation. Or small details of culture, even details that have been scoffed at by skeptics. So, for example, one person could be considered the high priest, and another person could be called the high priest at the same time. At one time, skeptics scoffed at this and said that when the Gospels of Luke and John imply multiple high priests, they were just making a mistake. But actually, we find this confirmed in Josephus, who calls two different people who were alive at the same time high priests, plural. They were another pair of priests, but this was due to the Romans' habit of deposing one high priest and putting another one in his place, and while the first one was still alive. And that's exactly how John and Luke refer to them. The author of Acts, who is also the author of Luke, knows an enormous number of tiny details. We find in Acts, I'm just going to give you one example. This is a whole presentation all in itself, the location of the little island of Cauda. Other authors of the time get that location wrong. But when he describes it, when he's telling of the Apostle Paul's ship voyage, he implies indirectly its location correctly. And we found that island of Cauda, showing that he was present on that voyage very plausibly and was a companion of Paul. And so, therefore, he would have had a chance to talk to the disciples. And there's evidence of his actually interviewing Peter. Now, you couldn't just look this stuff up. There was no atlas in a public library that you could just go to and just sit down and look it all up and then weave it into a historical novel. It didn't work that way. As I mentioned, other authors of the time even got that location wrong. What about internal evidences? Now, these take a little more to set up, but I'm just going to give you a sampler of them. One kind that I've written a whole book on called Undesigned Coincidences connects the different accounts of the Gospels and the casual things that they casually mention. That casualness is very important. Here's just one example. At the feeding of the 5,000 account, in John, Jesus says to Philip, "Where can we buy bread that these may eat?" Now, he wasn't really going to send them to buy bread, but he's got, I think, a little twinkle in his eye there and wants to see what the disciples will say. But why did he ask Philip? Well, there's one chance in 12 that Philip was just the one standing there, but we can do a little better than that. In the Gospel of Luke, completely different gospel, we hear it mentioned that this took place near a town called Bethsaida. Well, so what? Well, if you go back to a different passage, two different passages, in fact, in John, but not even close to the feeding of the 5,000, John casually mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. But he doesn't bring that up or the location when he tells about the feeding. You have to put all these three little puzzle pieces together to get that Jesus was probably saying to Philip, Where can we buy bread? Because Philip was from nearby. That makes sense, and that's what we call an undesigned coincidence. But notice how casual they are. They don't seem to be trying to fit their accounts together. We also have something that I've called unexplained allusions. I talk about this both in The Mirror or the Mask and in The Eye of the Beholder. Here's just one example. What was the argument about in John 3? In John 3, John mentions that the disciples of John the Baptist, a different John, were arguing about purification rites with another Jew. And purification rites were important to them. And they come to their leader, their rabbi, John the Baptist, and they say, Teacher, that man, and they mean Jesus, whom you spoke of and pointed to, he's baptizing and everybody's coming to him. So they're complaining that Jesus is more popular. And John the Baptist answers them, and he's humble, and he says that Jesus must increase and that he must decrease. What gets dropped? The dispute. What was it about? How did John the Baptist address it? How did his answer address it? No idea. Never explained. Now we find that we drop in unexplained allusions when we're truthfully talking. We forget that our audience may not know what we're talking about. If I'm speaking to an elderly person and I say that someone DM'd me, that person DM'd me, and that person isn't on Twitter, that person isn't on Facebook, I may forget that they don't know what DMing is. I mentioned this conference to my sister-in-law, who passed it on to my father-in-law, and she had to ask me on his behalf, where is this conference taking place? And when I said it's based in India, she passed back to me that he said, is Lydia in India? Because he is not familiar with online conferences. And then I realized that he wouldn't understand that Areopagus was an online conference. So then I explained it to him. But when I first mentioned Areopagus 2022, I didn't explain it because it didn't occur to me. I was just telling about Areopagus. It didn't occur to me that he wouldn't know what an online conference was. This happens all the time when people are unself-conscious. And we find the gospel authors being unself-conscious like this of what their audiences would know and wouldn't. A third kind of evidence is the unique personalities of people that we find across multiple authors. It's often said that Jesus in John is very different from Jesus in the synoptics. That's not what I find. And I support with multiple data points his being the same person but in different stories in all four gospels. And the same is true of Peter. But this is very hard to do fictionally, to show these subtle similarities of the personalities, but in different stories. These internal and external evidences also fit very well with the external information we have from the church fathers about who the authors were, because they would have been in positions to know either personal disciples of Jesus or just at one remove, those who knew personal disciples of Jesus. Now, if these authors are that reliable, then I think we can argue that they didn't make things up. And we can argue that they were careful about what to include. They weren't just, you know, carelessly telling something from a unreliable source where um, they were just passing something on that they had no reason to believe was true, and that they were either actual eyewitnesses themselves or that they were very close. It looks like they then recorded what the original witnesses claimed. Now that's my data point, that they recorded what the original witnesses claimed. And then, as you remember, I did an inference to the best explanation among those three options: lying, mistaken, or telling the truth, that the best explanation of those original claims was that Jesus really was risen from the dead. This view of the Gospels is a unified view. It explains all the evidence much better than a disunified view. You'll sometimes see a disunified view where someone will say, well, they get all those things right, but those are nuggets of information. Those are just like little nuggets of information. And then over here, they were making things up. I call that a schizophrenic view of the authors. That they're reliable, 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 they're truthful, 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 and then suddenly, boom, they start embellishing this account of the most important event that they record throughout the entire gospel. Now, that's not a very unified view. It's a psychologically disunified view where we have all these signs of truthful testimony, but suddenly at other times they're considering themselves to have license and freedom to invent and change the facts. I would ask you to consider the implausibility of that disunified view where the authors of the Gospels are going back and forth between truthfulness and untruthfulness. And that brings us back to the all important questions. Who is Jesus? What happened after he died? Did he really rise again? I'm not asking unbelievers to accept the conclusion that he rose again on blind faith. If you do not believe in Jesus, if you are a skeptic, I'm not saying just take the Gospels on faith. Nope. I'm asking unbelievers to accept that Jesus rose again because that's the best explanation of all the facts and all the evidence put together. Once we realize that we can base our faith on historical fact, we can have trust and confidence and commitment so that faith is not a blind leap, but faith is trust and assurance in what we have reason to accept, even though it didn't happen before our own very eyes. If you want to know more, I'm going to suggest some various resources that you can check out. The 3 books, which Ankit mentioned at the beginning, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, and The Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. I want to emphasize that all of these are available in Kindle, and I want to emphasize that because if you would find it more expensive or more difficult to get that in a physical copy, it is available for less and purely electronically in Kindle. But there are also free resources. You can find my author page on Facebook. That's Lydia McGrew Author, and you can follow that. You can also subscribe for free to my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is just Lydia McGrew. You can also email me, lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. I want to emphasize, please be sure to introduce yourself just briefly when you write. You can tell me that you saw me on Areopagus 2022. You can tell me whether you're a believer or an inquirer or whatever, just something brief. Also, I would suggest that you emphasize a specific question that you have to ask that is really a question you have, rather than emailing me a link to an entire long presentation and saying, give me your thoughts on this whole presentation. I would prefer to address a specific question that is bothering you or concerning you. But you're very welcome, very free to do that.